The sky above Belgorod was a strange shade of gray on the morning of. The silence was shattered just after 4:15 a.m. by a coded communication that crackled across secure Russian military channels. The man at the center of the storm was Andrei Rimovich Belousov, replacing Sergei Shoigu, a man who had dominated the post for over a decade, pleading and planning. But never quite achieving the elusive breakthrough, the Kremlin demanded Shoigu. Tactics that would blind the enemy long enough for a territorial rout. He had whispered of these plans in private strategy meetings. But each time he had been waived, off until now, Belousov, armed with economic insight, had done something Shoigu never could. He rewired the war economy in 6 weeks. Ammunition plants in Admurcia were running 24 hours a day. New drone factories had appeared almost overnight across Tatarstan. The Chinese had discreetly allowed the transshipment of critical microchips. Iranian engineers were quietly embedded in Russian labs. It wasn't just preparation, it was silent acceleration. At 4:45 a.m. Moscow time, it began a swarm of 127 Geran-2 drones, reinforced with new jamming-resistant circuits, sliced through the airspace over northeastern Ukraine. Their paths were erratic, dipping and weaving like furious insects. The drones weren't targeting military bases this time. They were hunting radar arrays, communication hubs, and power relays. The drones that reached Kharkiv hit high-voltage substations, plunging districts into darkness just as Ukrainian anti-air batteries began waking up simultaneously. An electromagnetic pulse device miniaturized and deployed via a high-altitude balloon launched covertly over the Kursk frontier detonated the Ukrainian Eastern Command. Structure went blind for nearly 7 minutes. Those 7 minutes were all Belousov needed. Under the fog of electronic silence, Russian airborne brigades deployed not eastward as expected, but from the north and south. From Belarusian forests came elements of the 76th Guards Air Assault Division. Canals and punched through the defenses near Kryvyi Rih. But the impossible part, the one thing Shoigu had begged for, drafted plans for and always failed to implement, was not merely a coordinated attack, it was the split for over a year. Shoigu had tried and failed to create a wedge between the NATO-trained units in the east and the reserve territorial defense forces in the west. He had theorized that if Ukraine could be fractured internally, not only militarily but psychologically, the war would tilt. No one had believed it was possible until July 30th. Belousov did not ask. He executed, unknown to almost all in the Russian military hierarchy. Fake defectors, fluent in Ukrainian, had slowly infiltrated units in Dnipro and Venetia. On the morning of July 30th, using spoofed Ukrainian command signals, they spread falsified orders claiming that Kyiv had abandoned eastern forces and was preparing to sue for peace under NATO pressure. Panic erupted in battalions around the city of Poltava. Ukrainian soldiers, cut off from comms, began retreating westward. Thinking they had been betrayed, Russian forces didn't even need to fight through the gap. They walked into it by 8:25. Belousov's troops had seized the city of Lozova with minimal resistance. By noon, the eastern Ukrainian defense lines were crumbling not due to firepower. Ukraine's government scrambled to clarify, but the damage was done. Morale had been cracked. Commanders couldn't reach their units. Videos began circulating of Ukrainian conscripts surrendering in groups. In a rare and grim address, President Zelensky confirmed that the entire Donetsk front had collapsed. He pledged counterattacks and vowed not to surrender. But the shock was visible in his eyes. And in Moscow, Belousov, and still in his gray civilian suit, watched it unfold from a darkened operations room beneath the Ministry of Defense. Shoigu stood beside him, arms folded, jaw clenched. The older man had spent years pushing for such a moment, but he was not the one in command. "Now they'll listen," Belousov said. Almost to himself, Shoigu gave no reply. 75,000 Russian troops had reoccupied territory lost months earlier. Western media outlets were scrambling. NATO ministers called emergency sessions. Washington was silent, caught between disbelief and dread. This was not a tactical victory. It was a strategic realignment of the war. What Belousov had done on that fatal morning was something even Russia's old military elite had not believed possible. He redefined the battlefield, not just by firepower, but by silence, misdirection, and fear. He collapsed trust inside the enemy. The Ukrainians weren't just outgunned, they were psychologically outmaneuvered. In Kyiv, suspicion spread like wildfire. Accusations of betrayal, infiltration, and foreign manipulation surged through military channels. Trust fractured, and with it, so did cohesion. It was the morning that changed everything, a morning where calculations replaced brute force, where the impossible was no longer just theory, where Belousov, the economist, not the general, made the entire Eastern theater bow. And Shoigu, he stood in the shadows, realizing that the war he had tried to win through might was now being won by the mind of a man he had once dismissed. The morning of July 30th would be remembered not just for its suddenness, but for the silent, shattering sound of one empire's strategy finally working.